Around 500,000 workers are expected to strike in the UK, making it the largest wave of industrial action in over a decade.
Russian shelling carries on in eastern Ukraine, with locals braving the daytime to get food and finding shelter at night.
Around 500,000 workers are expected to walk out today as the UK prepares for the most significant wave of industrial action in over a decade. Downing Street has warned of a day of significant disruption as teachers, train drivers and civil servants call for better pay. Firefighters are also set to strike later this month, a move that follows nurses and other healthcare workers. Today's picket lines will be mounted outside schools, train stations, universities, and government buildings, and rallies will be held across the country.
Good enough. But there is a growing anger in this.
At the same time, protesters will be demonstrating against the government's controversial plans for a new law, which would require a minimum level of operation in some essential services during strikes. Unions have dubbed it the anti-strike bill, saying it would lead to workers who legally vote to strike being fired. A senior government source says Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has made it clear that unions must call off strikes before serious negotiations can take place. Around 600 military personnel are expected to be deployed to mitigate the effects of the strike, most of them on border duties.
Nighttime in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, and the sound of shelling from both sides fills the skies. Locals are forced underground, and in one cellar 6 children and about 20 adults try to occupy themselves and try get some sleep. One girl has been living in the shelter for 6 months with her grandparents. Her mother had to stay in a town taken by the Russians.
When we lived in this other town, we had a bombing right across the street from our house. I was so scared, and it's still with me. We came here, I saw that it was worse, but I convinced myself that I could survive. I tried to forget the bombing. It's dangerous everywhere. In Ukraine, there is this threat, and at least here, we are home.
Daytime falls and locals leave their shelters to get food off Ukrainian soldiers.
A week ago we were still holding our positions, but now we are forced to retreat. We are going to put our best soldiers further back to recover and show our strength.
With the ongoing fighting, being far from cover is always a risk, but many have learned to adapt.
At first I was startled all the time, and now I stay calm.
But the time above ground is kept to a minimum, the elderly lady admits when she goes back into her cellar, where she sits and says her prayers.
Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets this Tuesday, breaking France to a standstill. For a second time this month, different unions from school teachers to railway workers staged a massive strike against government plans to raise the retirement age. Despite this, French President Emmanuel Macron is standing firm on the planned pension reform. In France, on the railway networks this Tuesday, only 1 in every 3 high-speed trains was operating. This has pushed the French Transport Minister Clément Beaune to recently announce that the government is looking into reforming the country's laws when it comes to strikes, saying the government wants to follow the Italian style when it comes to the laws there for strikes. But what does that exactly mean? First of all, in Italy, railway workers are not allowed to strike during holiday season. So that includes Christmas, Easter, and also in August when a lot of Italians go on vacation. Also, the unions have to provide a minimum service level of transport if striking during the rest of the year. That means that certain workers have to keep the trains operating. And, for example, that includes up to 50% of operational trains during peak hours. They also have to give a 10-day notice, while in France it's only 5. So how do other countries in Europe compare? Well, in Portugal, for example, there's also a similar law like in Italy, which imposes a minimum service in essential sectors such as transportation. And the government is allowed to call on its workers to guarantee that at least 25% of the trains are operating during strikes. In Spain, a minimum service is also guaranteed, but it's a little bit less strict than in Italy and in Portugal. One long-distance train per day must be operational, and up to 60% of regional trains must keep running during a strike. And this also includes a mandatory 8-day notice prior to announcing this industrial action. However, in Austria and Germany, it's a little bit more strict. Civil servants do not have the right to strike as their services are considered essential. But in Germany, these workers only represent 30% of the personnel in the public service, since the rest are considered private sector workers, making it therefore possible for some civil servants to strike. And it's not just France that felt inspired by these Italian strike laws. In the UK, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is considering a bill imposing a minimum service in transport and emergency services during industrial action as the country faces historic protests.
At 35, Mylène is far from retirement, and yet she demonstrated for the first time in her life against the extension of the contribution period in France. This is the case for many young French people who are entering the labour market later than their elders.
En tant que femme, déjà de base, on est obligé d'avoir un congé maternité si on a des enfants. Donc on est obligé de stopper notre carrière. Souvent quand on reprend le travail, on ne travaille pas à temps plein, on travaille à mi-temps. Et ça impacte forcément notre retraite plus tard. Si la réforme elle passe, on ne pourra jamais revenir en arrière. Donc c'est maintenant ou jamais.
As Paris fills up with protesters, Mylène joins her friend Benjamin, who regrets not having high hopes for his pension. But he wants to be heard.
C'est un peu pour dire au gouvernement que j'en ai marre de toutes ces réformes qu'ils sont en train de faire. Parce qu'ils sont en train de casser, pour moi, ils sont en train de casser toute la fonction publique.
Emmanuel Macron and his government claim that this reform is essential to save the French pay-as-you-go system, an argument that does not convince the demonstrators.
L'objectif, c'est que toute cette mobilisation, elle mette un terme à cette réforme, tout simplement. Et il va falloir faire beaucoup de manifestations, à mon avis, parce que là, ils n'ont vraiment pas l'air de nous écouter. Donc, ça va prendre du temps, je pense. Mais j'y crois quand même.
La mobilisation des jeunes sera l'une des clés de la poursuite de ce mouvement de contestation. Elle est pour l'instant difficile à quantifier. En revanche, les sondages sont formels. Une immense majorité des actifs français restent opposés à cette réforme. Cyril Fourneris, Euronews, Paris.